What if every choice you make isn't really yours? Right now, as you're watching this, invisible psychological forces are quietly manipulating your thoughts, reshaping your memories, and controlling your decisions. These aren't conspiracy theories. They re-scientifically proven mental mechanisms that operate below your conscious awareness every single day. Some can make you doubt your own eyes. Others can implant false memories that feel completely real. These discoveries will challenge everything you thought you knew about free will, memory, and the nature of reality itself. Let's uncover the psychological mind games that have been shaping your world all along. A few can even convince you to act against your own interests. Welcome to one of the most unsettling paradoxes of human cognition, the illusory truth effect. You've seen this fact countless times in movies, casual conversations, motivational posts. It feels familiar, comfortable, true. But here is the twist that would make any philosopher's head spin. This truth is completely false, yet your brain has been quietly filing it away as reality simply because of repetition. In the original 1977 study by Hasher, Goldstein, and Topino, participants were explicitly told that certain statements were false. Yet, after repeated exposure, they still rated these false statements as more likely to be true than novel statements. We don't choose to believe repeated information. Our brains do it automatically, beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. And algorithms amplify popular content. The illusory truth effect has become a force that shapes collective reality. The answer lies in understanding that recognizing this bias is the first step toward transcending it. It suggests that reality, at least as we experience it, is partially constructed by the frequency of our encounters with information. In a world where fake news spreads faster than verified facts, understanding the illusory truth effect isn't just intellectually interesting. It's essential for navigating modern life with clarity and wisdom. You approach the concession stand, and the prices seem straightforward. Small popcorn for $3, medium for $6.50, large for $7.50. Your brain quickly calculates that the large is obviously the better deal, only $1 more for significantly more popcorn. But here's the mind-bending reality. You've just fallen victim to the decoy effect, and your rational choice was carefully orchestrated. When we become aware of our brain's tendency to conflate familiarity with truth, we can begin to implement conscious strategies to verify information, seek diverse sources, and question our automatic responses. In his famous magazine subscription study, students were offered 3 options: online-only subscription for $59, print-only for $125, and Print Plus Online for $125. When all 3 options were present, 84% chose the Print Plus Online option. But when the seemingly useless print-only option was removed, only 32% chose the Print Plus Online option. The presence of the decoy completely reversed people's preferences. Echo chambers don't just reinforce our beliefs, they literally rewire our sense of what's true. Perhaps true rationality isn't about making consistent choices in isolation, but about understanding the contextual influences that shape our decisions and compensating for them. In a world where choice architecture is increasingly sophisticated, recognizing the decoy effect becomes a crucial skill for maintaining autonomy in our decision-making. Knowledge of the manipulation doesn't eliminate its influence, a phenomenon that challenges our assumptions about rational decision-making. It's as if our brains are running 2 separate systems, one that understands the manipulation intellectually, and another that responds to the comparative signals automatically. Are we truly making independent decisions, or are we simply responding to carefully crafted choice architectures? Recent longitudinal studies from 2021 have shown that this effect works across time intervals from minutes to months, suggesting that our susceptibility to false repeated information is both immediate and persistent. Restaurants place expensive items on menus not to sell them, but to make moderately priced items seem reasonable. Real estate agents show overpriced houses first to make the actual target property appear like a bargain. Our brains don't have access to absolute value scales. They work through relative comparisons. This makes us vulnerable to manipulation, but also provides insights into how we can make better decisions. By understanding that our preferences are contextual, we can become more aware of when our choices might be influenced by irrelevant factors. Technology companies offer multiple service tiers, specifically to guide customers toward their preferred option, but malleable constructs that can be manipulated by the presence of irrelevant alternatives. The medium popcorn, the decoy, wasn't meant to be purchased. It was strategically priced to make the large popcorn appear irresistibly valuable. It's as if our rational mind and our intuitive processing system are operating on completely different wavelengths. Yet human psychology operates by an entirely different logic. We don't evaluate options in isolation. We make comparisons, and those comparisons can be hijacked by clever third options. From the coffee shop where you choose your drink to the relationships you form, these cognitive puppet masters are pulling the strings of your reality in ways that would astound you. The decoy is designed to be clearly inferior to one option, while being only partially inferior to another. This creates what psychologists call dominance reasoning, a mental shortcut where we choose the option that obviously beats another option. The decoy doesn't need to be attractive. It just needs to make the target look attractive by comparison. Marketing executives have weaponized this effect, turning slogans into perceived truths through sheer repetition. Just do it isn't just a catchphrase. It becomes a life philosophy. Political propagandists understand that a lie repeated often enough begins to feel like truth, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Today, we re-exploring 20 of the most mind-bending psychological phenomena that reveal just how beautifully complex and surprisingly predictable the human mind truly is. Are you ready to peek behind the curtain of consciousness and discover what's really driving your behavior? Our brains, those magnificent pattern recognition machines, have developed a cognitive shortcut that equates familiarity with truth. When we encounter information repeatedly, our neural pathways process it more fluently, like a well-worn path through a forest. This ease of processing creates what psychologists call processing fluency, and our brains mistakenly interpret this smooth mental flow as a signal of truth. 1. The illusory truth effect. When repetition becomes reality, imagine a world where truth isn't determined by evidence, but by the number of times you've heard something. Picture this scenario. You're scrolling through social media, and you encounter a claim that we only use 10% of our brains. The illusory truth effect reveals a fundamental flaw in how we process information. The paradox deepens when we consider that this effect persists, even when people know the information is false. This psychological phenomenon doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's the invisible architect of our information age. The most chilling aspect of this mind game is its unconscious nature. Consider the implications. In our hyperconnected world, where information spreads at the speed of light, the paradox forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If our brains are hardwired to mistake repetition for truth, how can we ever trust our own judgment about what's real? This mind game reveals that truth and perception are far more malleable than we'd like to believe. 2. The decoy effect. The art of manufactured preference. Step into a movie theater, and you're about to witness one of the most elegant psychological manipulations ever devised. The decoy effect, also known as asymmetric dominance, reveals a profound paradox about human decision-making. Our preferences are in fixed internal values. This psychological phenomenon strikes at the heart of economic theory, which assumes that adding irrelevant options shouldn't change preferences between existing choices. The mechanics of this mind game are beautifully simple, yet profoundly unsettling. Dan Ariely's groundbreaking MIT experiments revealed just how powerful this effect can be. The paradox becomes even more intriguing when we consider that the decoy effect works even when people are aware of it. This mind game operates everywhere in our daily lives, often invisibly. The deeper philosophical implications are staggering. If our preferences can be systematically manipulated by irrelevant alternatives, what does this say about free will and autonomous choice? The decoy effect reveals that context isn't just important, it's everything. The paradox forces us to reconsider what we mean by rational decision-making. 3. The curse of knowledge, when expertise becomes a prison. Picture a brilliant professor standing before a classroom of eager students, explaining a concept that seems crystal clear to her. She uses technical terminology, assumes background knowledge, and moves quickly through complex ideas. Once we acquire specialized understanding, we lose the ability to simulate the mental state of not knowing. Our brains, optimized for using knowledge efficiently, cannot easily unknow what we've learned. The students look confused, frustrated, even defeated. The professor, genuinely puzzled by their confusion, thinks, "This is so obvious. Why don't they understand?" She's trapped in one of psychology's most ironic paradoxes, the curse of knowledge. Experts don't realize they're cursed because their expertise makes everything seem obvious to them. Leaders who have deep understanding of their company's strategy often fail to communicate it clearly to employees, assuming everyone shares their context and comprehension. They must suppress their natural tendency to use efficient, expert-level thinking, and instead simulate the slower, more deliberate cognitive processes of novices. This is cognitively demanding and often feels unnatural, like a virtuoso pianist trying to play at beginner level. The result is strategic confusion and poor execution, despite the leader's good intentions and genuine expertise. In our increasingly specialized world, where expertise is more valuable than ever, the ability to overcome the curse of knowledge becomes a crucial meta skill. It's not enough to be an expert. We must also be expert at sharing our expertise. We typically think of knowledge as additive. The more we know, the better equipped we are to handle any situation. You estimate it will take you about 10 hours to complete research, outline, writing, editing, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits, even when we have extensive experience with similar past projects. This isn't just poor estimation. It's a systematic bias that persists despite repeated evidence of our temporal miscalculations. When we plan, we naturally focus on the ideal scenario, what the project will look like when everything goes according to plan. We imagine ourselves working efficiently, encountering no unexpected obstacles, and having no competing priorities. Students consistently underestimate how long assignments will take, despite having completed dozens of similar assignments. Software developers are notorious for underestimating project timelines, leading to the industry joke that you should always multiply initial estimates by 3. But the most spectacular examples occur in large-scale projects. The Sydney Opera House was planned to take 4 years. Our brains are prediction machines, constantly trying to anticipate the future, but they're optimized for best-case scenarios rather than realistic assessments. This optimism bias served our ancestors well in environments where taking action despite uncertainty was often better than paralysis. But in our modern world of complex projects and tight deadlines, this ancestral programming creates systematic problems. This optimism drives us to take on ambitious projects and pursue challenging goals, but it also sets us up for frustration and failure when reality doesn't match our expectations. The fallacy occurs when our narrative system overrides the lessons of our experiential system, creating a persistent gap between expectation and reality, and cost $7 million. It actually took 14 years and cost $102 million. We experience the present moment as concrete and immediate, while the future feels abstract and malleable. Effective strategies for overcoming the planning fallacy include reference class forecasting, pre-mortem analysis, and building in buffer time for unexpected complications. This temporal asymmetry makes us overconfident in our ability to control future events while underestimating the challenges that await us. This inside view feels concrete and vivid, making it seem more probable than it actually is. It seems reasonable, even generous. 2 weeks later, you're frantically typing at 3 a.m., having spent 25 hours on what you thought would be a 10-hour project. Experienced project managers, who have witnessed countless projects exceed their timelines, still produce optimistic estimates for new projects. This suggests that the bias isn't simply about lacking experience. It's about how our cognitive architecture handles future planning. Even when we're aware that previous projects took longer than expected, we convince ourselves that this time will be different. This time we'll be more disciplined, more focused, more prepared. This optimistic bias isn't just wishful thinking. It's a fundamental feature of how our brains process temporal information. Welcome to the planning fallacy, a cognitive bias so pervasive that it affects everyone from college students to mega project managers planning billion-dollar infrastructure. By recognizing that our expertise creates blind spots, we can develop strategies to bridge these gaps, using analogies, providing context, checking for understanding, and remembering what it felt like to be a beginner. This statistic is particularly striking because it suggests that even when people are trying to be extremely conservative in their estimates, they still fall victim to the fallacy. The bias isn't just about being mildly optimistic. It's about a fundamental misunderstanding of how time, complexity, and uncertainty interact. The curse of knowledge, once recognized, becomes a challenge to overcome, rather than a prison that isolates us from others. The curse suggests that knowledge is also transformative, fundamentally changing how we perceive and process information. Expertise doesn't just add to our capabilities. It rewires our cognitive architecture in ways that create new blind spots. They discovered that when people plan future projects, they engage in what psychologists call focusing illusion. Concentrating on this specific scenario, they replanning, while ignoring the broader context of their past experiences and potential complications. They experience what psychologists call false consensus bias, the assumption that others share their knowledge and perspective. True wisdom might involve not just acquiring expertise, but maintaining the ability to bridge expertise gaps through effective communication. The most skilled teachers and leaders are those who can overcome their curse, translating complex ideas into accessible language without losing essential meaning. This creates a communication gap that widens with expertise, paradoxically making the most knowledgeable people less effective at sharing their knowledge. When experts process information in their domain, they use rich, interconnected mental models that allow them to see patterns, make connections, and understand implications that novices simply cannot perceive. This expertise creates what psychologists call chunking, the ability to group complex information into meaningful units. But this mental deficiency comes at a cost. Experts lose access to the step-by-step reasoning that novices need to follow. The curse of knowledge reveals a fundamental contradiction in human cognition. The very expertise that makes us knowledgeable becomes a barrier to communicating that knowledge to others. Doctors explain medical conditions using jargon that patients can't understand, then wonder why patients don't follow treatment plans. Financial advisors assume clients understand concepts like compound interest or risk tolerance that actually require significant background knowledge. This psychological phenomenon was formally identified by Kammerer, Lowenstein, and Weber in 1989, building on earlier work about hindsight bias. The curse manifests as an inability to accurately assess what less informed people understand, leading to communication breakdowns across expertise gaps. But the deeper paradox lies in the fact that knowledge, traditionally viewed as purely beneficial, creates its own form of cognitive limitation. Consider the mechanics of this mind game. The curse operates across countless domains. Software developers create user interfaces that make perfect sense to them, but baffle ordinary users. The most insidious aspect of this curse is its invisibility to those who suffer from it. Stanford Business School studies have shown that the curse of knowledge significantly impacts strategic communication effectiveness. The paradox deepens when we consider that overcoming the curse requires experts to deliberately handicap their own cognitive abilities. But perhaps the most profound implication of the curse of knowledge is what it reveals about the nature of expertise itself. This mind game forces us to reconsider the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. The paradox also highlights the importance of cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and simulate another person's mental state. Understanding this curse offers a pathway to more effective communication across knowledge gaps. 4. The planning fallacy. Our optimistic temporal illusions. Imagine you're a student with a term paper due in 2 weeks. The planning fallacy reveals a fascinating paradox about human temporal perception. We consistently underestimate the time, costs. The phenomenon was first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their groundbreaking 1979 research on decision-making under uncertainty. The mechanics of this mind game are both elegant and maddening. Meanwhile, our brains systematically ignore the outside view, the statistical reality of how similar projects have actually unfolded in the past. The planning fallacy operates across scales from the mundane to the monumental. Research reveals that only about 45% of students finish projects by their 99% confidence deadline. The paradox deepens when we consider that the planning fallacy persists even among experts who should know better. The psychological mechanisms underlying this fallacy are complex and interrelated. The planning fallacy also reveals something profound about the nature of time itself, or at least our perception of it. Understanding this mind game has practical implications for how we approach planning and decision-making. The paradox forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. We are fundamentally optimistic creatures, living in a world of uncertainty and complexity. Perhaps the most profound insight from the planning fallacy is that it reveals the tension between two different modes of thinking: the experiential system that learns from past events and the narrative system that constructs hopeful stories about the future. 5. Asch conformity. The invisible tyranny of group consensus. Picture yourself sitting in a psychology experiment, surrounded by 7 other participants. The researcher shows you a simple task: match the length of a line to one of 3 comparison lines. The answer is obvious, laughably obvious. Line A is clearly the correct match. But then, something impossible happens. When these 2 aspects of our nature conflict, social pressure often wins, even when the stakes are seemingly trivial and the correct answer is objectively clear. The first participant confidently states that line C is correct. The second agrees. The third. The fourth. By the time it's your turn, 6 people have unanimously chosen what you know to be the wrong answer. What do you do? Asch identified 2 primary drivers: normative social influence and informational social influence. When faced with unanimous group opposition, our brains activate both systems simultaneously, creating overwhelming pressure to conform. They didn't just pretend to see what the group saw. They actually started to question what they were seeing. In variations of the experiment, Asch found that having just one ally, one other person who gave the correct answer, reduced conformity rates to only 5%. This suggests that conformity isn't just about being outnumbered. It's about being isolated. Brain imaging studies show that when people conform to group judgments, areas associated with perception and judgment show reduced activity, while areas associated with social cognition become more active. This suggests that conformity isn't just a conscious decision. It's a neurological process that can literally change how we process information. We can also practice what psychologists call minority influence, the ability to introduce new ideas and perspectives that can eventually shift group consensus. We cannot think in isolation from our social environment, but we can become more aware of how that environment shapes our thinking. By understanding the power of conformity, we can make more conscious choices about when to go along with the group and when to trust our own judgment. The Asch effect helps explain how fashion trends spread, how workplace cultures develop, and how political movements gain momentum. This courage isn't just about being contrarian. It's about maintaining intellectual integrity in the face of social pressure. In our increasingly polarized world, where echo chambers and filter bubbles amplify group consensus, the ability to think independently becomes even more crucial. It illuminates the psychology behind groupthink in corporate boardrooms, where dissenting opinions are suppressed in favor of false consensus. It also provides insight into more troubling phenomena, such as how ordinary people can participate in mob behavior or remain silent in the face of injustice. A single dissenting voice can shatter the illusion of consensus and give others permission to trust their own judgment. In a world where social media algorithms create artificial consensus and polarization makes dissent costly, the lessons of these experiments are more relevant than ever. They challenge us to be not just independent thinkers, but courageous ones, willing to stand alone when truth demands it. This suggests that group pressure can literally alter our perception of reality, not just our willingness to voice our opinions. While excessive conformity can lead to poor decisions and moral failures, some degree of conformity is essential for social functioning. We need to be able to coordinate our behavior with others, follow social norms, and sometimes defer to expertise. The challenge lies in knowing when to conform and when to resist. This is the setup for one of psychology's most chilling experiments, Solomon Asch's conformity studies. The results reveal a disturbing truth about human nature. We will literally deny the evidence of our own eyes to avoid standing alone against group consensus. If our judgments can be so easily swayed by group pressure, how much of our thinking is truly independent? Are we making our own choices, or are we simply reflecting the consensus of our social environment? The Asch experiments, conducted in the 1950s, exposed a fundamental paradox of human cognition. We are simultaneously independent thinking beings and social creatures desperate for acceptance. On critical trials where the group unanimously gave wrong answers, 32% of participants conformed. These weren't weak-willed individuals or people with poor eyesight. They were ordinary people whose perceptual judgment was overwhelmed by social pressure. The statistics are sobering. In Asch's original experiments, 75% of participants conformed to the group's incorrect judgment at least once. The deeper paradox lies in how this conformity operates. Asch discovered that conformity wasn't just about external compliance. Many participants genuinely began to doubt their own perception. The psychological mechanisms underlying conformity are both fascinating and frightening. The power of this mind game becomes even more apparent when we consider what breaks it. The Asch experiments reveal conformity as a double-edged sword. The implications extend far beyond laboratory settings. The paradox of conformity forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about free will and individual autonomy. Modern neuroscience has begun to illuminate the biological basis of conformity. The Asch experiments also reveal the importance of social courage, the willingness to stand alone against group pressure when necessary. Understanding conformity pressure offers strategies for resistance. Knowing that unanimity is key to conformity's power, we can seek out diverse perspectives and create environments where dissent is valued. The paradox of conformity ultimately reveals that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose individual cognition is deeply intertwined with group dynamics. The Asch experiments stand as a powerful reminder that independence of thought requires constant vigilance. 6. The bystander effect. The paradox of collective inaction. Picture this haunting scenario. A woman is attacked on a busy city street while dozens of people walk by, each assuming someone else will help. This isn't fiction. It's the chilling reality of the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how the presence of others, can paradoxically reduce our likelihood of helping someone in need. The bystander effect exposes a fundamental contradiction in human nature. We are social creatures who evolve to cooperate and help one another. Yet the very presence of other people can trigger psychological mechanisms that inhibit our natural helping instincts. Their groundbreaking research revealed that this wasn't a story of urban callousness, but rather a predictable psychological phenomenon that affects virtually everyone under the right conditions. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when the presence of others dilutes our sense of personal obligation to act. When one participant appeared to have a seizure, 85% of those who believed they were the only witness intervened within the first minute. But when participants thought 4 other people were also listening, only 31% intervened, and those who did help took significantly longer to act. When we're uncertain about whether help is needed, we look to others for cues about appropriate behavior. In smoke-filled room experiments, individuals alone reported the emergency within 2 minutes 75% of the time, while groups of 3 took an average of 6 minutes, with many never reporting the smoke at all. The presence of others doesn't just reduce helping behavior, it can literally prevent people from recognizing emergencies. Brain imaging studies show that when people witness emergencies in group settings, areas associated with empathy and moral reasoning show reduced activation compared to when they witness the same situations alone. Research has shown that the effect can be dramatically reduced through simple interventions. Making people aware of the phenomenon, assigning specific roles and responsibilities, and creating accountability mechanisms can all help break the cycle of collective inaction. It suggests that true moral courage isn't just about having good intentions. It's about understanding the psychological barriers that prevent us from acting on those intentions and developing strategies to overcome them. By recognizing the bystander effect, we can become more aware of our own susceptibility to collective inaction and more intentional about taking responsibility when action is needed. Emergency responders are trained to point to specific individuals and give direct commands. You in the blue shirt, call 911. This suggests that the presence of others doesn't just influence our behavior. It literally changes how our brains process moral information. In our increasingly connected world, where we are constantly surrounded by others both physically and digitally, the ability to overcome bystander psychology becomes crucial for maintaining a compassionate society. But if everyone else appears calm and uninvolved, we interpret this as evidence that the situation isn't serious, even when everyone else is making the same calculation. But by the complex interplay between our psychology and our social environment. Why cyberbullying occurs in front of hundreds of online observers, and why social movements often struggle to gain momentum despite widespread sympathy for their cause. It illuminates the psychology behind somebody else's problem, syndrome, and the tendency to assume that others will take action when we don't. We like to think of ourselves as moral agents who would naturally help others in need, but the bystander effect shows that our actions are heavily influenced by situational factors we may not even consciously recognize. This creates a feedback loop where collective inaction reinforces itself. In a crowd, we unconsciously assume that someone else will take charge, that someone else is more qualified to help, or that someone else has already called for assistance. Social media platforms can amplify the phenomenon by creating the illusion that millions of others are witnessing the same injustice, leading to a digital diffusion of responsibility. The ease of sharing content can paradoxically reduce the likelihood of meaningful action, as people substitute symbolic gestures for substantive intervention. This mental calculus happens automatically below the threshold of conscious awareness. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any individual is to intervene, a paradox that challenges our assumptions about human compassion and social responsibility. This mind game was first systematically studied by John Darley and Bibb Latané following the infamous 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York, where 38 witnesses allegedly failed to help or call police. The mechanics of the bystander effect operate through two primary psychological processes: diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance compounds this effect by creating a false consensus about the seriousness of the situation. The experimental evidence is both precise and disturbing. In Darley and Lataine's classic 1968 study, participants believed they were discussing personal problems with other students over an intercom system. The paradox deepens when we consider that this effect occurs even in situations where helping would be easy and safe. This mind game reveals something profound about human social cognition. Our behavior is not determined solely by our individual values and intentions. The implications extend far beyond emergency situations. The bystander effect helps explain why workplace harassment can persist even when many people witness it. Modern technology has created new dimensions of the bystander effect. The neuroscience of the bystander effect reveals fascinating insights about moral decision-making. But understanding the bystander effect also provides pathways for overcoming it. The paradox of the bystander effect ultimately reveals that moral behavior is not just about individual character. It's about understanding and designing social systems that support ethical action. This mind game challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about moral responsibility in group settings. 7. Social proof. The invisible choreographer of human behavior. Imagine walking down a busy street and noticing a crowd of people all looking up at a building. Without thinking, you find yourself stopping and craning your neck to see what has captured their attention. We look to others for guidance, assuming they possess knowledge we lack. From an evolutionary perspective, following the crowd made perfect sense. If everyone else was running from a predator, it was wise to run too, even if you hadn't seen the threat yourself. This ancient wisdom served our ancestors well in environments where conformity often meant survival. But in our modern world, this same mechanism can lead us astray, causing us to follow crowds toward decisions that serve neither our individual interests nor collective well-being. Consider restaurant selection. An empty restaurant might serve excellent food, but its emptiness signals to potential customers that others have judged it poorly. Social media metrics, likes, shares, comments, followers, serve as quantified social proof that influences everything from political opinions to consumer choices. The famous laugh track phenomenon demonstrates this perfectly. Television shows use recorded laughter to trigger social proof, making audiences laugh at jokes they might not find funny in isolation. The artificial social signal convinces our brains that others are finding the content humorous, which makes us more likely to laugh ourselves. Products or ideas that lack social proof struggle to gain traction, regardless of their inherent merit. Charitable organizations have learned to publish donor lists not just to recognize contributors, but to create social proof that encourage additional donations. Public health campaigns use social proof by highlighting how many people engage in healthy behaviors rather than focusing on the prevalence of unhealthy ones. Environmental initiatives succeed when they emphasize that most people in your neighborhood recycle, rather than that recycling is good for the environment. This creates a cold start problem where genuinely valuable innovations fail to spread, simply because they lack initial social validation. To recognize when conformity serves our interests and when it doesn't, and to understand how our own actions contribute to the social proof that influences others. In a world where social signals are increasingly digitized and manipulable, this intelligence becomes essential for navigating modern life with wisdom and autonomy. Brain imaging studies reveal that when people observe others making choices, the same neural networks activate as when they make similar choices themselves. This suggests that social proof isn't just about conscious imitation. It's about unconscious neural simulation of others' decision-making processes. The paradox is that sometimes the best ideas are the ones that haven't been tried yet, but social proof biases us toward the familiar and popular. The number of views on a video, the rating of a product, or the popularity of a social media post creates artificial social proof that can drive massive behavioral changes. We cannot think in isolation from our social environment, but we can become more aware of how that environment shapes our thinking. By understanding the power of social proof, we can make more conscious choices about when to follow the crowd and when to trust our own judgment. What once required physical presence and direct observation now operates through digital signals that can be manipulated and manufactured. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where good restaurants fail due to lack of initial customers, while mediocre restaurants succeed simply because they appear popular. When likes can be bought, reviews can be fabricated, and viral content can be artificially promoted, the social signals we use to guide our behavior become increasingly unreliable. This creates a crisis of social epistemology. How do we know what others really think when the signals of social proof can be manufactured? This cognitive shortcut, known as heuristic processing, allows us to make quick decisions in ambiguous situations by copying the actions of those around us. Investment bubbles often form when investors see others buying certain assets and assume they must know something valuable. The dot-com bubble of the 1990s and the housing bubble of the 2000s were both driven in part by social proof. Investors poured money into overvalued assets because they saw others doing the same. The cascading effect created artificial demand that temporarily sustained unsustainable prices. But this seemingly rational strategy creates a psychological vulnerability that can be exploited in ways that would astound our ancestors. In his famous hotel towel study, guests were far more likely to reuse towels when told that. The majority of guests in this room reused their towels compared to standard environmental messages. The mere knowledge that others had engaged in the behavior made it seem more appropriate and desirable. This effect increased towel reuse by 26%, a significant change from a simple information frame. There might be nothing there at all, but the mere act of others looking up compels you to do the same. Welcome to the power of social proof, one of the most pervasive and influential psychological phenomena shaping human behavior. Social proof operates on a deceptively simple principle. When we are uncertain about how to behave in a situation, the paradox of social proof lies in its simultaneous rationality and irrationality. The mechanics of social proof operate through what psychologists call informational social influence, the assumption that others' actions reflect superior knowledge about the correct course of action. When we see others behaving in a particular way, our brains automatically calculate that they must know something we don't. This isn't conscious reasoning. It's an automatic cognitive process that happens below the threshold of awareness. Robert Cialdini's groundbreaking research revealed just how powerfully social proof shapes behavior across domains. The cascading nature of social proof creates what economists call information cascades, situations where people sequentially follow the actions of those before them, potentially leading entire groups away from optimal decisions. The digital age has amplified social proof to unprecedented levels. The most insidious aspect of social proof is how it can override our individual judgment and values. Financial markets provide dramatic examples of social proof in action. The power of social proof becomes even more apparent when we consider its absence. Understanding social proof reveals both its dangers and its potential for positive change. The neuroscience of social proof shows how deeply embedded this mechanism is in our cognitive architecture. The digital manipulation of social proof raises profound questions about authenticity and autonomy in our connected age. The paradox of social proof ultimately reveals that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose individual decision-making is deeply intertwined with collective behavior. This mind game challenges us to develop what we might call social intelligence, the ability to distinguish between genuine social proof and manufactured signals. 8. Groupthink. When harmony becomes hazardous picture, The most important decision-makers in American government gathered in a room, all brilliant minds, all experienced leaders, all committed to protecting their nation's interests. The year is 1961, and they're planning what will become known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Despite clear warning signs and significant risks, not one person voices serious dissent. The result? One of the most spectacular foreign policy disasters in American history. This is groupthink in action, a psychological phenomenon that turns our greatest strength, our ability to work together, into our greatest weakness. The social bonds formed in these cohesive groups create powerful emotional rewards that make dissent feel not just uncomfortable, but treasonous. Members begin to define their identity through their group membership, making criticism of group decisions feel like criticism of themselves. Groupthink reveals a chilling paradox about human collaboration. The very qualities that make groups effective, cohesion, loyalty, shared purpose, can also make them dangerously irrational. And intelligence fell into a pattern of mutual reinforcement that prevented critical analysis. Online communities can develop extreme consensus on controversial topics, with dissenting voices quickly silenced or driven away. When people are in highly cohesive groups, areas of the brain associated with critical thinking and independent judgment show reduced activity, while areas associated with social bonding and conformity become more active. They can structure decision-making processes to encourage critical thinking and avoid premature consensus. Most importantly, they can model intellectual humility by acknowledging uncertainty and encouraging others to question their ideas. Homogeneous groups are more susceptible to groupthink because members share similar backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. True collaboration isn't about achieving harmony at all costs. It's about combining individual expertise and perspectives to make better decisions than any individual could make alone. This requires groups to embrace what researchers call productive discomfort, the willingness to tolerate disagreement and uncertainty in service of better outcomes. Diverse groups, while potentially more difficult to manage, are more likely to generate the cognitive diversity needed to avoid groupthink traps. The stakes are simply too high to allow the comfort of false consensus to override the necessity of critical thinking. By recognizing the signs of groupthink and implementing strategies to prevent it, we can harness the power of group collaboration while avoiding its most dangerous pitfalls. This suggests that groupthink isn't just about social pressure. It's about fundamental changes in how our brains process information in group settings. The speed and scale of digital communication can accelerate groupthink processes, allowing false consensus to spread rapidly across large networks of people who never meet in person. High-performing groups need some degree of cohesion and shared purpose, but they also need what psychologists call constructive controversy, the ability to challenge ideas, question assumptions, and explore alternative perspectives without threatening group unity. Engineers at Morton Fiacol had serious concerns about O-ring performance in cold weather, but these concerns were overridden by group pressure to maintain the launch schedule. Groups need to be able to disagree about ideas and strategies while maintaining respect and trust for one another as individuals. This requires sophisticated social skills and emotional intelligence that many groups lack. The 2008 financial crisis revealed how major banks and financial institutions had fallen into groupthink patterns, convincing themselves that housing prices would never fall and that complex financial instruments had eliminated risk. The shared assumptions and mutual reinforcement within these organizations prevented critical questioning that might have revealed the systemic risks they were creating. The organizational culture at NASA had become so focused on consensus and can-do attitudes that dissenting voices were marginalized. The result was a preventable disaster that killed 7 astronauts and damaged public trust in the space program. They dismissed intelligence reports about the strength of Castro's forces, ignored warnings about the invasion's feasibility, and convinced themselves that the operation would be quick and successful. The desire to maintain group cohesion prevented anyone from asking the hard questions that might have revealed the plan as fundamental flaws. When groups become too harmonious, too unified in their thinking, they lose the ability to critically evaluate their own decisions. The desire to maintain group unity overrides the need for careful analysis, leading to catastrophic failures that might have been prevented by a single dissenting voice. Irving Janis, who coined the term in 1971, identified groupthink as a psychological phenomenon that occurs when the desire for harmony within a group results in dysfunctional decision-making. The group prioritizes consensus over accuracy, loyalty over logic, and comfort over critical thinking. First, groups develop an overestimation of their own capabilities, manifesting as illusions of unanimity and beliefs in the group's inherent morality. Second, they exhibit closed-mindedness, including stereotyping of outsiders and rationalization of warning signs. Third, they create pressure toward uniformity through self-censorship, direct pressure on dissenters, and the emergence of mind guards who protect the group from contradictory information. Members suppress their doubts, ignore contradictory evidence, and convince themselves that their group is inherently moral and infallible. The mechanics of groupthink operate through 8 distinct symptoms that Janis organized into 3 categories. The psychological appeal of groupthink is understandable. It feels good to be part of a unified, harmonious group where everyone agrees and works toward common goals. The Bay of Pigs invasion exemplifies classic groupthink dynamics. President Kennedy's advisory team. Despite their individual expertise, the Challenger space shuttle disaster provides another tragic example of groupthink in action. Corporate boardrooms are particularly susceptible to groupthink, especially when led by charismatic CEOs who discourage dissent. The digital age has created new forms of groupthink through social media echo chambers and algorithmic filtering. The neuroscience of groupthink reveals how group dynamics can literally change brain function. The paradox of groupthink is that the very qualities we value in teams, trust, loyalty, shared vision, can become toxic when taken to extremes. Understanding groupthink provides strategies for prevention. Effective leaders can assign devil's advocate roles, bring in outside experts to challenge group assumptions, and create psychological safety for dissenting voices. The antidote to groupthink isn't the absence of group cohesion. It's the cultivation of what researchers call task conflict, while minimizing relationship conflict. The study of groupthink also reveals the importance of diversity in group composition. The phenomenon of groupthink ultimately challenges us to reconsider what we mean by effective teamwork. In our increasingly complex world, where many challenges require coordinated group action, understanding and preventing groupthink becomes essential. The foot in the door technique, the staircase of compliance. Imagine a stranger approaches you on the street and asks if you'd be willing to put a large, unsightly billboard supporting safe driving in your front yard. Your immediate response? Probably a firm no. But what if the same stranger first asked you to display a small window sticker with the same message? We become psychologically invested in maintaining consistency with that initial commitment, making us far more likely to agree to larger related requests. This isn't just about social pressure or reciprocity. It's about how our brains maintain a coherent sense of self-identity through behavioral consistency. You might agree to that modest request. When we agree to a small request, we begin to see ourselves as the kind of person who supports that cause or engages in that behavior. Once we've made a commitment, even a small one, we experience psychological pressure to align our future actions with that commitment. The person who agrees to display a small safe driving sign begins to see themselves as someone who cares about traffic safety. This identity shift makes them more receptive to larger requests related to the same cause. The technique doesn't just change behavior, it changes how people think about themselves. The requests must be related to the same cause or identity, and there should be sufficient time between requests for the initial commitment to influence self-perception. Most importantly, The initial compliance must feel voluntary rather than coerced. This pressure operates through multiple channels. We want to appear consistent to others. We want to feel consistent to ourselves. Social media platforms use micro-commitments like likes, shares, and comments to build user engagement. Each small action increases psychological investment in the platform, making users more likely to spend time and attention on the service. This creates opportunities for positive change through incremental commitment, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The same mechanisms that make us susceptible to manipulation also allow us to use small commitments to build beneficial habits and behaviors. The key is developing the wisdom to recognize when these mechanisms are being used ethically versus exploitatively, and to use them consciously in our own lives to achieve our authentic goals. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can make more conscious choices about the commitments we make and the identities we construct through our actions. Dating apps use similar strategies, starting with simple swipes and building to more substantial commitments like profile completion and message exchanges. And we want to reduce the cognitive dissonance that would arise from acting inconsistently. When people make commitments, areas of the brain associated with self-control and future planning become more active. When used to encourage positive behaviors like charitable giving, environmental conservation, or health promotion, the technique can serve social goals. But when used manipulatively to exploit people's psychological vulnerabilities, it becomes a tool for unethical influence. This suggests that commitments don't just change how we think about ourselves. They literally change how our brains process future decisions. This self-perception change creates internal pressure to act consistently with our new self-image. And if you do, you've just taken the first step up a psychological staircase that makes you dramatically more likely to agree to that billboard later. Recognizing when others are using foot-in-the-door strategies can help us make more conscious decisions about our commitments. We can also use the technique ethically to encourage positive behaviors in ourselves and others, understanding that small initial commitments can lead to significant long-term changes. Welcome to the foot-in-the-door technique, a compliance strategy that exploits our deep psychological need for consistency. The foot-in-the-door technique reveals a fascinating paradox about human behavior. Once we agree to a small request, they might start by asking for signatures on a petition, then request a small donation and ask for volunteer time, and finally solicit major gifts. Each step builds psychological commitment that makes the next request more likely to succeed. The American Cancer Society's Light Up a Life campaign exemplifies this approach, starting with small remembrance donations and gradually building to major philanthropic commitments. The technique gets its name from the door-to-door sales practice of literally getting a foot in the door. Once the salesperson could prevent the door from closing, they had a much better chance of making a sale. They might start by asking people to sign up for email updates, then request social media shares, then ask for volunteer hours, and finally solicit campaign contributions. Each level of engagement increases psychological investment in the campaign's success, creating a ladder of escalating commitment. But the psychological mechanism goes much deeper than this metaphor suggests. It taps into fundamental aspects of human cognition and self-perception that operate automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness. Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, groundbreaking 1966 study at Stanford University provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. They approached homeowners with a request to install a large, ugly, "Drive carefully" sign in their front yards. Only 17% agreed to this reasonable but inconvenient request. But when researchers first asked a different group to display a small 3-inch "Be a Safe Driver" sign in their windows, which 76% agreed to, and then returned 2 weeks later with a large sign request, 76% agreed to the billboard. The initial small commitment had quadrupled compliance with the larger request. 9. The psychological mechanisms underlying the foot in the door technique are rooted in what Leon Festinger called cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that arises when our actions and beliefs are inconsistent. The technique works through a process psychologists call commitment and consistency. The power of this mind game lies in its ability to transform identity through action. Charitable organizations have mastered the foot in the door technique through carefully designed escalation strategies. Political campaigns use similar strategies to build supporter engagement. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The initial request must be large enough to create meaningful commitment, but small enough to ensure high compliance rates. The digital age has created new opportunities for implementing the foot in the door technique. The neuroscience of the foot in the door technique reveals how commitment changes brain function. The ethical implications of the foot in the door technique are complex and context dependent. Understanding this technique provides insights into both persuasion and resistance. The foot in the door technique ultimately reveals something profound about human nature. We are consistency-seeking creatures who use our past actions to guide our future decisions. The paradox of the foot in the door technique is that it simultaneously reveals our psychological vulnerabilities and provides a pathway for positive change. 10. The door in the face technique. The psychology of reciprocal concessions. Imagine a college student approaches you on campus with an unusual request. Would you be willing to volunteer as a counselor at a juvenile detention center for 2 hours every week for the next 2 years? The commitment seems enormous. 104 hours of your life. You politely decline. But then the student makes a much smaller request. Would you be willing to spend just 2 hours chaperoning a group of these kids on a trip to the zoo? Suddenly, this modest request seems quite reasonable. Research assistants approached college students with a request to spend 2 hours per week for 2 years counseling juvenile delinquents. After being asked to commit 104 hours, a 2-hour commitment feels trivial. Instead of evaluating the second request on its own merits, we evaluate it relative to the first request. This cognitive anchoring effect is so powerful that it can make objectively unreasonable requests seem not just acceptable, but generous. Second, the reciprocity principle kicks in when the requester concedes to the smaller request. We feel obligated to reciprocate with our own concession. Third, the technique can generate guilt about rejecting the initial request, making us more susceptible to the follow-up. Subscription services might initially promote annual plans, then offer monthly plans that seem more reasonable by comparison. Software companies use freemium models where premium features are priced high, making basic paid subscriptions seem like reasonable compromises. Predictably, no one agreed to this enormous commitment. Brain imaging studies show that when people perceive concessions from others, areas associated with reward processing and social bonding become active. When used in genuine negotiations where both parties benefit from finding mutually acceptable terms, the technique can facilitate productive compromise. But when used manipulatively to exploit people's psychological vulnerabilities, it becomes a tool for unethical influence. We don't evaluate requests in isolation, but relative to our recent experiences and expectations. This creates opportunities for ethical influence, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. This suggests that reciprocity isn't just a conscious social strategy. It's a fundamental neural response to perceived fairness and cooperation. Our capacity for reciprocity and fairness represents evolved social intelligence that enables complex cooperation. But these same mechanisms can be hijacked to influence our behavior in ways that may not serve our best interests. Understanding these dynamics allows us to navigate social interactions more consciously and ethically. But when the same assistance followed up with a much smaller request, spending 2 hours chaperoning a zoo trip, 50% of students agreed. When the initial request creates a high anchor point, subsequent requests are evaluated relative to this anchor. making them seem more reasonable than they would in isolation. Labor unions might start with extreme demands they know will be rejected, then compromise to their actual desired terms. Recognizing when others are using this strategy can help us evaluate requests more objectively, focusing on the absolute merits of what is being asked, rather than being swayed by contrasts and reciprocity pressure. We can also use the technique ethically in our own negotiations, understanding that strategic concessions can create win-win outcomes. Sales professionals might begin with premium packages they don't expect to sell, then offer simplified versions that seem like bargains by comparison. Even children instinctively use this technique when they ask for something outrageous, then settle for what they actually wanted all along. Our brains are constantly calculating social debts and obligations, automatically triggering reciprocity responses when we perceive others making concessions. This suggests that fairness isn't just a moral principle, it's a fundamental cognitive process that shapes how we evaluate social interactions. In contrast, when students were only asked about the zoo trip, only 17% agreed. The requests must be made by the same person and be related to the same cause or organization. Agents might show buyers overpriced properties first, making their actual target properties seem reasonably priced by comparison. Car salespeople use similar strategies, starting with fully loaded models before compromising to mid-range options that include their desired profit margins. Most importantly, the initial request must be perceived as genuine rather than obviously strategic. The initial door in the face rejection had tripled compliance with the actual desired request. If you agree, you've just experienced the door in the face technique, a compliance strategy that exploits our deep psychological tendency toward reciprocity and fairness. The door in the face technique reveals a counterintuitive truth about human psychology. Sometimes, the best way to get what you want is to first ask for something you know you won't get. By starting with an unreasonably large request that will almost certainly be rejected, you create psychological conditions that make a subsequent, more reasonable request far more likely to succeed. This technique inverts our normal assumptions about negotiation and reveals how our brains process requests in relative rather than absolute terms. The psychological mechanisms underlying this technique are rooted in what Robert Cialdini identified as the reciprocity principle, one of the most powerful drivers of human social behavior. When someone makes a concession by reducing their request, we feel obligated to reciprocate with our own concession by agreeing to the smaller request. This happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness, as our brains calculate social debts and obligations. Robert Cialdini's seminal 1975 study provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. The technique works through multiple psychological channels simultaneously. First, the contrast effect makes the second request seem smaller and more reasonable by comparison. The power of the door in the face technique lies in its ability to reframe the entire negotiation context. Skilled negotiators have used variations of this technique for centuries. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The initial request must be large enough to create meaningful contrast, but not so outrageous as to seem insincere or manipulative. The real estate industry provides fascinating examples of door in the face dynamics. The digital age has created new contexts for door in the face techniques. The neuroscience of reciprocity reveals why the door in the face technique is so effective. The technique also exploits what psychologists call perceptual contrast, our tendency to evaluate options relative to available alternatives rather than in absolute terms. Understanding the door in the face technique provides insights into both persuasion and resistance. The ethical implications of the door in the face technique are nuanced. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human fairness and reciprocity. The door in the face technique ultimately demonstrates that human decision-making is contextual rather than absolute. The paradox of this technique is that it simultaneously reveals our psychological sophistication and our cognitive limitations. 11. The scarcity principle. When less becomes more, imagine walking into a store and seeing two identical items on the shelf. One has a simple price tag, while the other displays only 3 left in stock. Which one captures your attention? Which one suddenly seems more valuable? If you're like most people, the limited availability item not only grabs your focus, but actually appears more desirable. Welcome to the scarcity principle, a psychological phenomenon that transforms our perception of value through the simple suggestion that something might not be available forever. Participants were given cookies to taste from jars containing either 10 or 2 cookies. This explains why limited edition products often sell better than their regular counterparts, even when the only difference is the label. Flash sales with countdown timers, limited quantity messages, and exclusive membership offers all exploit our psychological vulnerability to scarcity. E-commerce sites show only 2 left in stock messages, and other customers are viewing this item. Alerts to create competitive pressure that drives immediate purchases. The suggestion that our choice might be restricted triggers an unconscious rebellion that increases desire. When we see others pursuing scarce items, it validates both the item's desirability and the urgency of acting quickly. A painting by an unknown artist becomes more valuable when it's described as one of only 5 remaining works. A wine tastes better when it's from a limited vintage. A social media post seems more important when it's from a verified account. The scarcity itself becomes a component of value, independent of the item's inherent qualities. This creates buying frenzies where people compete for items they might not even want in normal circumstances. Black Friday sales exemplify this phenomenon, with a combination of limited time, limited quantities, and social competition creates irrational purchasing behavior. The cookies were identical, but those from the nearly empty jar were rated as significantly more attractive and valuable. When people encounter scarce items, brain regions associated with reward anticipation and loss aversion become highly active. We can recognize when scarcity is being artificially created to influence our behavior, and we can use scarcity ethically to motivate positive actions. Environmental conservation campaigns often emphasize the scarcity of natural resources to motivate protection efforts. Educational programs highlight the limited availability of opportunities to encourage student engagement. This suggests that scarcity doesn't just influence our thinking. It triggers fundamental neural responses that evolve to help us compete for limited resources. We don't evaluate things in isolation, but relative to their availability and accessibility. This creates opportunities for ethical influence, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The key is developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine scarcity that reflects real value and artificial scarcity designed to manipulate our psychological responses. The scarcity made the exact same cookies taste better, demonstrating how availability affects our actual sensory experience. The scarcity principle reveals a fundamental paradox of human desire. We don't just want things because they're good. We want them more intensely when they're rare or difficult to obtain. This isn't rational economic behavior, where value is determined by utility. It's a cognitive bias that can make us prize mediocre limited editions over superior unlimited alternatives. Viral content spreads partly because of perceived scarcity, the fear of missing out on cultural moments that might disappear from collective attention. Dating apps exploit scarcity by showing limited profiles and suggesting that matches might disappear if not pursued quickly. Social media platforms create artificial scarcity through features like stories that disappear after 24 hours. The mere suggestion of scarcity activates powerful psychological mechanisms that can override our logical evaluation of worth. The psychological roots of scarcity effects run deep in our evolutionary history. Our ancestors lived in environments where resources were genuinely limited. Food, shelter, mates, and territory were all scarce commodities that required competition to obtain. The pain of losing something feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining it, making limited time offers psychologically compelling. Second, scarcity serves as a heuristic for quality. We assume that popular or hard-to-get items must be valuable, or they wouldn't be in such demand. Those who could quickly recognize and secure limited resources were more likely to survive and reproduce. This ancient programming remains embedded in our modern psychology, even when we're dealing with manufactured scarcity in abundant societies. The mechanics of scarcity work through multiple psychological channels. First, loss aversion makes us fear missing out on opportunities more than we value gaining equivalent benefits. Stephen Werchel's groundbreaking 1975 study provided clear evidence of how scarcity affects perception. The scarcity principle operates through what psychologists call reactance theory. When our freedom to choose is threatened, we experience psychological reactance that makes us want the restricted option even more. Modern marketing has weaponized scarcity through sophisticated techniques that create artificial urgency. The digital age has amplified scarcity effects through social media and online platforms. The neuroscience of scarcity reveals fascinating insights about how our brains process limited resources. The principle becomes even more powerful when combined with social proof. The paradox of scarcity is that it often creates value where none existed before. Understanding scarcity provides both protection against manipulation and insights into human motivation. The scarcity principle ultimately reveals that human value perception is contextual and comparative rather than absolute. 12. Intermittent reinforcement. The psychology of unpredictable rewards picture a person sitting in front of a slot machine at 3 a.m. feeding coins into a device that statistically guarantees they'll lose money. They've been playing for hours, losing steadily, yet they can't stop. They're not stupid, weak-willed, or irrational. They're experiencing one of the most powerful psychological phenomena ever discovered: intermittent reinforcement. This mind game reveals how unpredictable rewards can create more compulsive behavior than predictable ones, turning uncertainty into a form of psychological addiction. Dopamine neurons fire most intensely not when we receive rewards, but when we anticipate them. Gambling addictions are essentially intermittent reinforcement disorders, where unpredictable wins create psychological dependence despite overall losses. Partners who alternate between cruelty and affection create powerful psychological bonds that are difficult to break. Likes, comments, shares, and messages arrive unpredictably, creating a variable reward schedule that keeps users constantly checking their devices. The uncertainty about when social validation will arrive makes it more psychologically compelling than predictable rewards would be. This explains why people compulsively check social media, even when they consciously know it's not beneficial. Mobile games use variable reward schedules to keep players engaged, providing unpredictable bonuses, achievements, and progression markers. This counterintuitive finding has profound implications for understanding human motivation, addiction, and behavior change. It suggests that consistency isn't always the best strategy for maintaining long-term behavior. Sometimes strategic inconsistency is more effective. Dating apps exploit this principle by showing potential matches unpredictably, creating anticipation and compulsive checking behavior. Recognizing when our behavior is being shaped by unpredictable rewards can help us make more conscious choices about how we spend our time and attention. We're not just motivated by what we get, but by when and how we get it. This creates opportunities for positive behavior change, but also vulnerabilities that can be exploited by systems designed to capture and hold our attention. We can also use this principle ethically to maintain beneficial behaviors, understanding that occasional rewards can be more motivating than constant ones. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can use them to support our authentic goals while protecting ourselves from exploitation by systems that profit from our psychological vulnerabilities. Even email and text messaging operate on intermittent reinforcement principles, with unpredictable message arrival times creating checking compulsions. The unpredictability of kindness makes it more valuable and memorable than consistent affection would be. Victims become hypervigilant for signs of positive attention, and when it occurs, it provides intense relief that reinforces the relationship despite its overall toxicity, but not so rare as to cause extinction, and the behavior must be easy to repeat. Our tendency to continue behaviors that are occasionally rewarded reflects an evolutionary adaptation to uncertain environments where persistence in the face of occasional failure was necessary for survival. But when used to exploit psychological vulnerabilities for profit or control, they become tools for manipulation and harm. This same mechanism that helped our ancestors find food and mates in unpredictable environments can be hijacked by modern technologies and social systems. Variable ratio schedules are particularly effective because they create persistent uncertainty about when the next reward will arrive. Slot machines are particularly effective because they provide frequent small rewards on variable schedules, keeping players in a state of perpetual anticipation. The near-miss effect, when symbols almost line up, actually increases motivation by suggesting that a win is imminent. Unpredictable rewards create a state of constant anticipation, keeping dopamine levels elevated and driving continued behavior. This explains why people can become addicted to activities that provide only occasional positive outcomes. Intermittent reinforcement exposes a profound paradox about human motivation. We don't just want rewards. We become obsessed with rewards we can't predict. Brain imaging studies show that unpredictable rewards activate the same neural pathways as addictive drugs, creating changes in brain structure and function that persist long after the behavior stops. The uncertainty creates a state of arousal that can become psychologically necessary, making people feel anxious and empty when the intermittent rewards stop coming. A behavior that's occasionally rewarded becomes more persistent than one that's always rewarded. This counterintuitive finding challenges our basic assumptions about motivation and reveals how our brains are wired to respond to uncertainty in ways that can be both adaptive and destructive. The psychological mechanisms underlying intermittent reinforcement were first systematically studied by B.F. Skinner in the 1930s. His experiments with rats and pigeons revealed that animals would press levers or peck buttons more obsessively when rewards were delivered on unpredictable schedules rather than predictable ones. When rewards came regularly, animals would work just enough to get them. But when rewards were unpredictable, animals would work frantically, unable to determine the correct amount of effort needed. The human brain's response to intermittent reinforcement is rooted in our dopamine system, the neural circuitry that processes reward and motivation. The power of intermittent reinforcement becomes most apparent in its most destructive applications. Abusive relationships often maintain their hold through intermittent reinforcement patterns. Social media platforms have masterfully exploited intermittent reinforcement through their notification systems. The neuroscience of intermittent reinforcement reveals why it's so powerful. The technique's effectiveness depends on several crucial factors. The rewards must be meaningful to the recipient. The schedule must be unpredictable. The digital age has created new contexts for intermittent reinforcement through gaming and app design. The paradox of intermittent reinforcement is that it can create stronger behavioral patterns than consistent reinforcement, even when the average reward rate is lower. Understanding intermittent reinforcement provides insights into both motivation and resistance. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human hope and persistence. The ethical implications of intermittent reinforcement are significant. When used to maintain beneficial behaviors like exercise, learning, or creativity, variable reward schedules can support positive life changes. The intermittent reinforcement principle ultimately demonstrates that human behavior is shaped more by patterns of consequences than by absolute reward levels. The key to navigating intermittent reinforcement in our modern world is developing awareness of when our behavior is being shaped by unpredictable rewards and making conscious choices about which patterns we want to maintain. 13. False memory implantation. When yesterday never happened, imagine sitting in a therapy session, working through childhood memories with a well-meaning counselor. Through guided visualization and suggestion, you begin to recover vivid memories of events that never actually occurred. Our memories, which feel like direct recordings of reality, are actually reconstructions that can be influenced by suggestion, expectation, and imagination. This discovery challenges our basic assumptions about the reliability of consciousness and raises profound questions about the nature of truth and identity. Her most famous study, known as the Lost in the Mall experiment, showed that 29% of participants developed false memories of being lost in a shopping mall as children when family members suggested it had happened. First, suggestion plants the seed of a false event. The recovered memory movement of the 1980s and 1990s led to thousands of accusations of childhood sexual abuse based on memories recovered through suggestive therapeutic techniques. Many of these cases were later proven to be based on false memories, destroying families and lives in the process. The legal system had to grapple with the disturbing reality that eyewitness testimony, long considered the gold standard of evidence, could be systematically distorted. Then, imagination and visualization exercises help flesh out details. Social pressure and authority figures provide validation for the emerging memories. Legal systems have had to develop new procedures for handling eyewitness testimony, particularly in cases involving children or recovered memories. Therapeutic practices have been fundamentally altered, with many forms of memory recovery therapy now considered unethical. The research has also raised questions about the reliability of historical testimony and the nature of truth itself. Brain imaging studies show that false memories activate the same neural networks as true memories, making them subjectively indistinguishable. And consciousness, it has also been used to question the validity of genuine trauma memories. Our sense of self, built on memories of our past experiences, can be influenced by external suggestions and social pressures. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves from false memory implantation while still honoring the genuine experiences that shape our lives. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for positive therapeutic intervention. The challenge is to maintain appropriate skepticism about memory while still supporting trauma survivors and taking their experiences seriously. Our ability to construct and reconstruct memories reflects sophisticated cognitive processes that allow us to learn from experience and adapt to new situations. It reminds us that our memories are not infallible records of the past, but reconstructed narratives that can be influenced by present circumstances. Whether in therapeutic settings, legal proceedings, or personal relationships, we need to be aware of how suggestion and social pressure can contaminate memory. This doesn't mean we should doubt all memories, but we should be aware of the factors that can influence their accuracy. This understanding can help us approach our own memories with appropriate humility and skepticism, particularly when they concern emotionally charged events. But these same processes can be hijacked to create false realities that feel completely authentic. When people recall false memories, their brains show patterns of activation consistent with genuine recollection, including emotional responses and sensory details. This suggests that false memories aren't just cognitive errors. They're neurologically real experiences that happen to be based on events that never occurred. Finally, the false memories become integrated into the person's autobiographical narrative, feeling as real as genuine memories. And the person must be encouraged to visualize and elaborate on the suggested event. Doctored photographs can create false memories of events that never happened. Social media posts can implant false memories of shared experiences. Even exposure to others' false memories online can lead to their adoption as personal memories through a process called social contagion. Repeated exposure to suggestions increases the likelihood of false memory formation, as does the use of imagery and emotional processing techniques. The participants didn't just claim to remember the event. They developed rich, detailed memories, complete with emotional content and sensory details. The memories feel completely real. You can see the faces, hear the voices, feel the emotions. Memory isn't like a video recording that can be played back unchanged. It's more like a story that gets retold each time we remember it, with details potentially changing in each retelling. This reconstructive nature of memory makes it vulnerable to contamination from external sources, including leading questions, social pressure, and therapeutic suggestions. But these memories are false, constructed from fragments of genuine experiences and external suggestions. This is the terrifying reality of false memory implantation, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how malleable and unreliable our most precious cognitive faculty, memory, truly is. False memory implantation exposes one of the most unsettling paradoxes of human consciousness. The very mechanism that preserves our past can be hijacked to create convincing experiences of events that never happened. The psychological mechanisms underlying false memory creation are rooted in how our brains store and retrieve information. Elizabeth Loftus, the pioneer of false memory research, demonstrated these phenomena through hundreds of experiments involving over 20,000 participants. The process of false memory implantation typically involves several stages. The power of false memory implantation becomes most apparent in its most consequential applications. The neuroscience of false memories reveals why they feel so real. The technique's effectiveness depends on several factors. The suggested event must be plausible within the person's life context. The suggestion must come from a trusted source. The digital age has created new contexts for false memory implantation through social media and digital manipulation. The implications of false memory research extend far beyond individual psychology. The paradox of false memory implantation is that it reveals both the flexibility and fragility of human consciousness. Understanding false memory implantation provides crucial insights into the nature of memory and identity. The research also highlights the importance of critical thinking in evaluating claims about the past. The ethical implications of false memory research are profound. While the research has provided valuable insights into memory, the study of false memory implantation ultimately reveals that human consciousness is more fluid and malleable than we typically assume. The key to navigating false memory phenomena is developing what researchers call memory literacy, understanding how memory works, what factors can influence its accuracy, and how to evaluate memory claims critically. 14. The testing effect. Why struggling to remember makes memory stronger. Student B reads the material once, then spends time trying to recall the information from memory, struggling to remember details without looking at the text, are often less beneficial than activities that feel difficult and frustrating. This phenomenon challenges our intuitive understanding of learning and reveals how our brains are optimized for challenge rather than comfort. Which student will perform better on the exam? If you guessed student A, you'd be wrong. When we try to recall information, our brains engage in a process called retrieval practice that not only accesses existing memories, but also strengthens the connections that allow us to access them in the future. This is fundamentally different from simply recognizing information during rereading, which activates different neural networks and provides less lasting benefit. Student B, who appeared to be struggling and making mistakes, will likely outperform the diligent rereader. Second, the effort involved in retrieval creates multiple retrieval pathways, increasing the likelihood that information can be accessed under different conditions. EEG studies show that successful retrieval practice activates brain networks associated with executive control and working memory, creating more robust and flexible memory representations. The struggle involved in retrieval appears to trigger neuroplastic changes that strengthen memory networks. Teachers and trainers need to design experiences that challenge learners to retrieve information actively rather than simply recognize it passively. This might involve frequent quizzing, practice problems, or other forms of retrieval practice. Medical students who test themselves on diagnostic procedures show better clinical performance than those who repeatedly study case materials. But these feelings of progress are largely illusory. The real learning happens during the struggle to retrieve information from memory. Language learners who practice recalling vocabulary words outperform those who repeatedly review word lists. However, it also highlights the importance of designing educational systems that prioritize long-term learning over short-term performance, as the benefits of testing become more apparent over time. Even motor skills benefit from testing. Athletes who practice skills under testing conditions show better performance than those who practice without evaluation. Experts in any field have typically engaged in extensive retrieval practice, constantly testing their knowledge and skills under challenging conditions. This process of deliberate practice, which involves constant testing and error correction, appears to be essential for developing high-level expertise. Our brains are designed to learn through challenge and struggle, not through comfortable repetition. This creates opportunities for more effective education and training, but also requires us to embrace discomfort as a necessary part of the learning process. Third, the struggle to remember identifies gaps in knowledge, directing attention to areas that need further study. This counterintuitive phenomenon is called the testing effect, and it reveals a fundamental paradox about how our brains learn and remember. Spaced repetition software uses algorithms to present information for testing at optimal intervals, maximizing the benefits of retrieval practice. Online learning platforms incorporate frequent quizzing and self-testing features that leverage the testing effect. Even simple flashcard apps provide more effective learning than passive reading because they require active recall. Imagine two students preparing for an important exam. Student A reads through the material repeatedly, highlighting key passages and taking detailed notes. When students make mistakes during retrieval practice and then receive corrective feedback, they learn more effectively than when they study error-free materials. This suggests that the struggle and failure involved in testing create learning opportunities that smooth, comfortable study sessions cannot provide. The testing effect exposes a profound contradiction in how we think about learning. The activities that feel most effective in the moment, when we simply reread information, we create what psychologists call fluency illusions. The material feels familiar. Students who read passages and then took tests on the material significantly outperformed those who spent the same time rereading the passages. The testing group showed superior retention after both short delays and long delays, with the advantage becoming more pronounced over time. The act of retrieval, even when it involved errors and struggles, created stronger and more durable memories than passive review, and easy to understand, leading us to believe we've learned it well. But this fluency doesn't translate to long-term retention. In contrast, when we struggle to retrieve information from memory, we engage in what researchers call desirable difficulties, cognitive challenges that feel unpleasant but actually strengthen learning. The psychological mechanisms underlying the testing effect are rooted in how our brains encode and strengthen memories. Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpik's landmark, 2006, study provided compelling evidence for the testing effect. The power of the testing effect lies in its ability to strengthen the neural pathways involved in memory retrieval. The technique works through several complementary mechanisms. First, retrieval practice strengthens the memory traces themselves making them more resistant to forgetting. The testing effect operates across different types of learning and memory. The phenomenon becomes even more powerful when testing involves errors and corrections. The digital age has created new opportunities for implementing the testing effect through educational technology. The neuroscience of the testing effect reveals fascinating insights about learning and memory. The paradox of the testing effect is that it makes learning feel more difficult while making it more effective. Understanding the testing effect has profound implications for education and training. It suggests that effective learning requires strategic difficulty rather than smooth progress. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of expertise and skill development. The ethical implications of the testing effect are generally positive, as it provides evidence-based strategies for improving learning and performance. The testing effect ultimately demonstrates that effective learning requires active engagement with information rather than passive consumption. The key to leveraging the testing effect is understanding that difficulty and struggle are not obstacles to learning. They are learning. 15. The Stroop effect. When automatic processes collide. Imagine looking at the word "read" printed in blue ink and being asked to name the color of the text. This seemingly simple task becomes surprisingly difficult. Your brain wants to read the word "red" while you're trying to say "blue." When we see a word, our brains automatically read it. This process is so well learned that we cannot easily turn it off. When we see a color, our brains automatically process the visual information. But when these two automatic processes provide conflicting information, our cognitive system experiences interference that reveals the underlying mechanisms of attention and control. When we try to ignore the word meaning and focus only on the color, we must use executive control processes to suppress the automatic reading response. This cognitive effort creates measurable delays and errors, demonstrating that conscious control requires mental resources and is not always successful. Emotional Stroop tasks use emotionally charged words to study attention bias in depression and anxiety. Addiction researchers use drug-related words to study attentional bias in substance abuse. The effect has also been used to study aging, brain damage, and developmental differences in cognitive control. People with better executive control show smaller Stroop effects, suggesting that cognitive control abilities can be measured and potentially improved. Age-related changes in Stroop performance provide insights into how cognitive control changes across the lifespan, with older adults typically showing larger interference effects. This cognitive conflict, known as the Stroop effect, reveals a fundamental paradox about human information processing. Our highly efficient automatic systems can actually interfere with our conscious intentions. It shows that conscious control requires effort and resources, and that automatic processes can compete with conscious intentions. This understanding has practical implications for education, therapy, and performance optimization in situations requiring sustained attention. Our brains are constantly processing information at multiple levels, and conflicts between these processes can reveal the underlying architecture of consciousness. By understanding these mechanisms, we can better appreciate both the remarkable efficiency of automatic processing and the challenges of maintaining conscious control in complex environments. It demonstrates that we cannot simply decide to ignore irrelevant information. Our brains automatically process stimuli even when we're trying to focus on something else. This might involve reducing distractions, practicing mindfulness, or using environmental design to support focused attention. By understanding how automatic and controlled processes interact, we can make more conscious choices about how to direct our cognitive resources. Just as reading becomes automatic through extensive practice, cognitive control abilities can be strengthened through training and experience. This suggests that attention and focus are skills that can be developed rather than fixed capacities. This has implications for understanding attention disorders, meditation practice, and the challenges of maintaining focus in distracting environments. Our brains must resolve this conflict by selecting one response while suppressing others. The fact that we can read words automatically without conscious effort is a remarkable cognitive achievement that allows us to process information rapidly and efficiently. But this same automaticity can create interference when we need to focus on other aspects of stimuli, demonstrating the costs of cognitive efficiency. This process involves areas of the brain associated with executive control, including the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal cortex, which monitor for conflicts and implement control strategies. When we try to focus on one task while being bombarded with notifications and distractions, we experience conflicts similar to the original Stroop effect. Neuroimaging studies show that Stroop interference activates networks associated with conflict monitoring and cognitive control, including the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These areas work together to detect conflicts and implement control strategies to resolve them. The automatic processing of incoming information interferes with our conscious attempts to maintain focus, creating modern forms of cognitive interference. Reading is one of the most automatic processes in literate adults, happening so quickly and effortlessly that we cannot easily suppress it. Color naming, while also automatic, typically requires more conscious attention. When these processes conflict, the more automatic process tends to interfere with the less automatic one, creating mental conflicts that slow down our thinking and reveal the complex architecture of consciousness. The Stroop effect exposes the hidden complexity of tasks that appear simple on the surface. The psychological mechanisms underlying the Stroop effect are rooted in what cognitive scientists call automaticity, the ability to perform cognitive tasks without conscious attention or effort. John Ridley Stroop's original 1935 experiments provided the first systematic evidence of this phenomenon. Participants took significantly longer to name the colors of words when the word meaning and color were incongruent compared to when they were congruent or when naming colors of neutral stimuli. This difference in reaction time, now known as the Stroop effect, has been replicated thousands of times and has become one of the most studied phenomena in cognitive psychology. The power of the Stroop effect lies in its ability to reveal the automatic nature of reading and the limited capacity of our cognitive control systems. The technique works through what psychologists call response conflict, when different cognitive processes generate competing responses to the same stimulus. The Stroop effect has been adapted to study various aspects of cognitive processing beyond basic color-word interference. The digital age has created new contexts for Stroop, like interference through information overload and multitasking. The neuroscience of the Stroop effect reveals fascinating insights about brain function and cognitive control. The phenomenon becomes even more interesting when we consider individual differences in Stroop performance. The Stroop effect also reveals important insights about the nature of attention and consciousness. The paradox of the Stroop effect is that it reveals both the power and limitations of automatic processing. Understanding the Stroop effect provides insights into the nature of cognitive control and attention. The technique also highlights the importance of practice and training in developing cognitive control. The Stroop effect ultimately demonstrates that human cognition involves complex interactions between automatic and controlled processes. The key to navigating Stroop-like interference in daily life is developing awareness of when automatic processes might conflict with conscious intentions and implementing strategies to manage these conflicts. 16. Loss aversion. Why losing hurts more than winning feels good. Most people would choose the guaranteed $100, even though the coin flip has the same expected value. But emotional beings whose decisions are shaped by how options are framed relative to our current situation. The pain of losing $100 feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining $100, creating systematic biases in how we evaluate risks, make decisions, and respond to change. This discovery fundamentally challenged economic theories based on rational utility maximization and revealed the emotional foundations of human choice. When we face potential losses, our brains activate threat detection systems that create intense emotional responses designed to motivate protective action. When we face potential gains, our brains activate reward systems that create positive emotions. But these responses are typically less intense than the negative emotions associated with equivalent losses. Now imagine a different scenario. You must either lose $100 guaranteed or flip a coin where heads means you lose $200 and tails means you lose nothing. This reference point can be our current situation, our expectations, or a comparison standard suggested by how choices are presented. Investors hold losing stocks too long while selling winning stocks too quickly, a phenomenon known as the disposition effect. Brain imaging studies show that losses activate the amygdala and other structures associated with threat detection and negative emotion more strongly than gains. Activate reward centers. It combines with loss aversion to make divestment feel particularly painful, with status quo bias to maintain existing ownership patterns, and with sunk cost fallacy to justify continued ownership of items that no longer serve us. These interactions create powerful psychological forces that can trap us in suboptimal ownership patterns. This suggests that loss aversion isn't just a cognitive bias, it's a fundamental feature of how our brains process potential outcomes. And barrier to beneficial exchanges, it also reflects genuine psychological needs for security and identity. The key is finding balance between acknowledging the psychological reality of ownership, attachment, while not letting it prevent beneficial changes and adaptations. By overvaluing things we own, we may miss opportunities for beneficial trades and exchanges. Our sense of what things are worth depends not just on their inherent properties, but on our relationship to them. This might involve considering opportunity costs, seeking outside perspectives, or regularly reassessing whether our possessions still serve our current goals and values. By understanding how ownership affects our thinking, we can make more conscious choices about what to acquire, keep, and release. This creates both opportunities for satisfaction and fulfillment through meaningful ownership and traps that can prevent us from adapting to changing circumstances. Recognizing when our attachment to possessions is driven by ownership bias rather than genuine utility can help us make more rational decisions about what to keep and what to let go. We can also use this knowledge to negotiate more effectively, understanding how ownership affects others' valuations. By becoming attached to possessions that no longer serve us, we may accumulate clutter and waste resources. By inflating the value of our own contributions and possessions, we may create barriers to cooperation and negotiation. During market downturns, investors often make irrational decisions driven by the pain of realized losses, selling stocks at the bottom of the market cycle. Free trials make cancellation feel like a loss rather than a decision not to purchase. Our possessions become extensions of ourselves, incorporated into our sense of identity in ways that make divestment feel like personal loss. This suggests that the endowment effect isn't just about economic valuation, it's about psychological ownership and self-concept. Limited time offers create artificial reference points that make letting deals expire feel like losses. Social media platforms use streaks and progress, indicators that make stopping usage feel like losing accumulated benefits. The 2008 financial crisis saw massive selling as investors tried to avoid further losses, often locking in losses that might have been temporary. This behavior contradicts rational investment strategies, but reflects the emotional reality of loss aversion. Employees resist salary cuts more strongly than they welcome equivalent salary increases. Consumers are more motivated by messages about avoiding losses than by messages about achieving gains. Even small children show loss aversion when giving up toys they've been playing with. Changes in reference points can completely alter our preferences, making the same objective outcome feel like a gain or loss. Suddenly, most people become risk seekers, choosing the risky option to avoid the certain loss. This asymmetry reveals one of the most fundamental biases in human decision-making: loss aversion, the principle that losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Imagine you're offered two choices: receive $100 guaranteed, or flip a coin where heads gives you $200 and tails gives you nothing. Loss aversion exposes a profound paradox in human psychology. We are not rational evaluators of objective outcomes. The psychological mechanisms underlying loss aversion are rooted in how our brains process potential outcomes relative to reference points rather than in absolute terms. Their experiments revealed that people's choices systematically violated the predictions of rational choice theory, showing instead that decisions are influenced by how options are framed and whether they appear as gains or losses. This work ultimately earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. When we evaluate options, we don't consider their absolute value, but how they compare to our current situation or expectations. This reference dependence means that the same outcome can feel like a gain or loss depending on the starting point, creating predictable patterns of risk-seeking and risk-averse behavior. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's groundbreaking research in the 1970s provided the first systematic evidence of loss aversion through their development of prospect theory. The power of loss aversion lies in its ability to create asymmetric emotional responses to equivalent objective outcomes. The technique works through what psychologists call reference point dependence, our tendency to evaluate outcomes relative to a specific reference point rather than in absolute terms. Loss aversion manifests across countless domains of human behavior. The stock market provides dramatic examples of loss aversion in action. The digital age has created new contexts for loss aversion through design features that exploit this bias. The neuroscience of loss aversion reveals why losses feel more intense than equivalent gains. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how the endowment effect interacts with other psychological biases. The paradox of the endowment effect is that it often leads to behaviors that reduce overall welfare and efficiency. Understanding the endowment effect provides insights into both personal decision-making and market dynamics. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human attachment and identity. The ethical implications of the endowment effect are nuanced. While it can lead to inefficient resource allocation, the endowment effect ultimately demonstrates that human value perception is subjective and contextual rather than objective and universal. The key to navigating the endowment effect is developing awareness of how ownership influences our valuations and implementing strategies to evaluate possessions more objectively. 17. The endowment effect. How ownership changes value. Imagine you're given a coffee mug as a gift. Within minutes of receiving it, you begin to value that mug more highly than you would have if you are considering purchasing an identical mug in a store. This isn't about developing an emotional attachment. It's about how the mere fact of ownership changes your perception of value. When we own something, selling it feels like a loss, while not owning it feels like a neutral state. This asymmetry means that the pain of giving up something we own is greater than the pleasure of acquiring the same thing, creating systematic biases in how we value possessions. When people own an object, they begin to focus on its positive features. First, ownership creates a sense of psychological possession that makes giving up the item feel like a personal loss. Homeowners consistently overvalue their properties compared to market assessments, leading to houses sitting unsold for months. Investors hold on to losing stocks longer than winning ones because selling feels like realizing a loss. Even digital goods show endowment effects. People become attached to virtual items in games and social media accounts in ways that exceed their objective utility. When people view objects they own, brain areas associated with self-processing and reward become active, suggesting that owned objects become incorporated into our sense of self. This neural incorporation helps explain why giving up possessions can feel like losing parts of ourselves. Second, the effort invested in acquiring and maintaining possessions creates what researchers call investment bias, the tendency to value things more highly when we've invested effort in them. Third, ownership changes our reference point, making the owned state feel normal and the non-owned state feel like a loss. People develop attachments to social media profiles, online game characters, and digital collections that can rival their attachments to physical possessions. The psychology of ownership extends to intangible items, suggesting that the endowment effect is about psychological possession rather than just physical ownership, and develop what psychologists call attachment bias, a tendency to overweight the benefits of owned items while underweighting their costs. This attachment forms quickly and can persist even when the original reasons for ownership disappear. Homeowners often list their properties at prices significantly above market value, then gradually reduce prices over time as they slowly adjust to market realities. This isn't just optimistic pricing. It is a systematic bias where ownership creates inflated value perceptions that persist even in the face of contradictory market feedback. Welcome to the endowment effect, a psychological phenomenon that reveals how possession itself alters our evaluation of objects, making us reluctant to part with things we own, even when doing so would be economically rational. In their famous mug experiments, participants were randomly given coffee mugs and then offered the opportunity to trade them for chocolate bars. Only about 10% chose to trade, despite the fact that in control groups, people were roughly equally divided in their preferences between mugs and chocolate bars. The mere act of ownership had created a preference for the owned item. The endowment effect exposes a fundamental contradiction in how we think about value and ownership. Economic theory assumes that the value of an object should be independent of who owns it. A coffee mug should have the same value whether you own it or you're considering buying it. But human psychology operates by different rules. Once we own something, we begin to overvalue it, creating a gap between what we pay to acquire an item and what we accept to give it up. The psychological mechanisms underlying the endowment effect are rooted in loss aversion and our tendency to form rapid emotional attachments to objects in our possession. Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler's groundbreaking 1990 experiments provided clear evidence of the endowment effect. The power of the endowment effect lies in its ability to create value through possession rather than inherent utility. The technique works through multiple psychological channels. The endowment effect manifests across numerous domains of human behavior. The real estate market provides particularly clear examples of the endowment effect in action. The digital age has created new contexts for the endowment effect through virtual ownership and digital goods. The neuroscience of the endowment effect reveals fascinating insights about how ownership affects brain function. 18. Mental accounting. The irrational logic of money categories. Imagine you receive a $100 tax refund and immediately spend it on a luxury dinner, despite having significant credit card debt. Meanwhile, you diligently save money from your regular salary, even though mathematically it makes more sense to pay off high-interest debt first. A dollar is a dollar, regardless of its source. We mentally categorize money into different accounts and treat these categories as if they were separate resources. Our brains cannot easily process all financial decisions as part of one integrated system, so we create mental shortcuts by categorizing money into different accounts: regular income, windfall gains, savings, entertainment budgets, and emergency funds. Each category comes with its own rules and emotional associations. Tax refunds and bonuses often get spent on luxuries that people wouldn't buy with regular income, even though these are just different forms of the same resource. Money labeled as entertainment budget feels appropriate to spend on fun activities, while money labeled as emergency fund feels wrong to spend on anything but genuine emergencies. These labels create emotional associations that guide spending decisions. Similarly, people may keep money in low-interest savings accounts while carrying high-interest debt, because the savings account and debt account feel like separate financial domains. Credit cards create spending accounts that feel different from cash, leading to increased spending. Different types of financial decisions activate different neural networks, suggesting that mental accounting isn't just a cognitive strategy, but reflects genuine differences in how our brains process various financial resources. On one hand, it can lead to suboptimal decisions, like keeping low-interest savings while carrying high-interest debt. By treating retirement savings as a separate account that shouldn't be touched, people can maintain savings even when they face short-term financial pressures. Similarly, emergency funds provide psychological security that might not exist if people viewed all money as available for immediate use. On the other hand, it can support beneficial behaviors like retirement savings and emergency funds that people might not maintain if they treated all money as equivalent. Recognizing when our financial choices are driven by arbitrary mental categories rather than economic logic can help us make more rational decisions. We can also use mental accounting strategically to support beneficial financial behaviors through conscious categorization. This might involve regularly reviewing our overall financial situation, considering opportunity costs across all accounts, or using mental accounting strategically to support beneficial behaviors while avoiding its pitfalls. The emotional associations with different money categories create distinct patterns of brain activation. Our financial decisions are shaped by how we categorize and think about money, not just by mathematical optimization. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for better financial management through psychological insight. Money isn't just an economic resource. It's a psychological resource that carries emotional meaning and social significance. Understanding these influences can help consumers make more conscious financial decisions. Our financial behaviors reflect not just rational optimization, but also psychological needs for security, identity, and social connection. Digital wallets and payment apps create new mental categories for money. Budgeting apps often exploit mental accounting by creating explicit categories that help people manage their finances through psychological compartmentalization. The house money effect leads gamblers to take bigger risks with winnings than with their original stake. The sunk cost fallacy causes people to continue investing in failing projects because they've already put money into the project account. Retirement savings often remain untouched even when people have high-interest debt, because these feel like separate financial categories. This categorization leads to systematic biases in financial decision-making that can be both costly and beneficial, depending on the context. Lottery winners often spend their winnings on luxuries they would never buy with regular income, even though the money has the same economic value. Similarly, people treat gift cards differently from cash, often spending gift cards on items they wouldn't purchase with equivalent cash amounts. This seemingly irrational behavior reveals the power of mental accounting, a psychological phenomenon that shows how we create arbitrary categories for money that violate basic economic principles but reflect deeper truths about human psychology. Mental accounting exposes a fundamental paradox in how we think about money. Despite the fact that money is perfectly fungible, his research revealed that people make different decisions about money depending on which mental account it comes from, even when the economic consequences are identical. $1 from a tax refund feels different from $1 from regular wages, leading to different spending patterns. The psychological mechanisms underlying mental accounting are rooted in our need to organize and simplify complex financial information. Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 for his work on behavioral economics, identified mental accounting as a key feature of human financial behavior. The power of mental accounting lies in its ability to create spending and saving behaviors that wouldn't occur if we treated all money as equivalent. The technique works through what psychologists call psychological framing. The way we categorize and label financial resources affects how we think about using them. Mental accounting manifests across numerous financial behaviors. The phenomenon becomes particularly apparent in how people handle windfalls versus regular income. The digital age has created new contexts for mental accounting through various payment systems and financial apps. The neuroscience of mental accounting reveals fascinating insights about how our brains process financial information. The paradox of mental accounting is that it can be both helpful and harmful to financial well-being. The positive aspects of mental accounting include its ability to support long-term financial goals through psychological compartmentalization. Understanding mental accounting provides insights into both financial decision-making and behavior change. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of human financial psychology. The ethical implications of mental accounting are significant. Financial services companies often exploit these psychological tendencies through product design and marketing that takes advantage of how people categorize money. Mental accounting ultimately demonstrates that human financial behavior is fundamentally psychological rather than purely economic. The key to navigating mental accounting is developing awareness of how our mental categories affect our financial decisions and implementing strategies to evaluate financial choices more holistically. 19. Gaslighting. The systematic erosion of reality. Imagine being in a relationship where your partner consistently denies things you know happened, tells you you're being too sensitive when you express concerns, and gradually convinces you that your memory, perception, and judgment are unreliable. Over time, you begin to question your own sanity, becoming dependent on their version of reality. This is gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation so insidious that it can make victims doubt their own mental faculties and lived experiences. Gaslighting reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of human psychological vulnerability, our sense of reality, which feels rock solid and independent, can be systematically undermined through persistent manipulation. When we encounter contradictions between our perceptions and external feedback, our brains experience cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state that demands resolution. First, denial and contradiction. The gaslighter consistently denies things that happened or presents alternative versions of events. Intimate partners, parents, employers, and authority figures are all positioned to exploit their influence to make victims doubt their own experiences. The victim might notice discrepancies, but dismiss them as misunderstandings. Gradually, the contradictions become more frequent and significant. The victim begins to question their own memory and perception. Eventually, the victim becomes dependent on the gaslighter's version of reality, unable to trust their own judgment. The closer the relationship, the more devastating the effects, as victims lose their primary sources of emotional support and reality validation. Victims often struggle with long-term effects, including difficulty trusting their own judgment, chronic self-doubt, anxiety, depression, and problems forming healthy relationships. The systematic undermining of reality perception can create lasting psychological damage that requires significant time and often professional help to overcome. Gaslighting isn't just about winning arguments or getting one's way. It's about fundamentally altering another person's relationship with reality. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for mental health professionals, legal systems, and society as a whole. The technique also highlights the importance of maintaining diverse sources of reality, validation, and trusting our own experiences, even when others challenge them. This makes it one of the most damaging forms of psychological manipulation, as it attacks the very foundations of psychological functioning. And seeking support when we notice patterns of reality contradiction in our relationships. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves and others from this devastating form of manipulation. Digital communications can be deleted, edited, or taken out of context, making it easier to create contradictions and deny previous statements. Warning signs include persistent denial of your experiences, being told you're too sensitive or overreacting, isolation from friends and family, and increasing self-doubt about your own perceptions. Recognition is the first step toward protection and recovery. Social media platforms can be used to isolate victims from support networks and spread false narratives about their behavior or mental state. People with low self-esteem, trauma histories, or strong needs for approval are particularly susceptible. The technique can also exploit cultural factors, using societal biases about gender, race, or mental health to make victims' experiences seem less credible. Keeping journals, maintaining outside relationships, and seeking professional support can all help victims reconnect with their own reality and rebuild psychological autonomy. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for healing through supportive relationships that validate our experiences and help us reconstruct reliable reality perception. Second, reality distortion. They reframe situations to make the victim appear unreasonable or unstable. Chronic stress from persistent reality contradiction can alter brain structure and function, particularly in areas associated with memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Victims often show symptoms similar to those seen in trauma and abuse survivors, including hypervigilance, anxiety, and depression. Third, isolation. They separate the victim from other sources of reality validation. Fourth, credibility attacks. They undermine the victim's reputation and reliability to others. Gaslighting exploits this by creating systematic contradictions that gradually erode the victim's confidence in their own perceptions. The technique works by exploiting our fundamental need for coherent understanding of our experiences and our tendency to trust authority figures and intimate partners over our own perceptions when conflicts arise. This fictional scenario perfectly captures the essence of gaslighting, creating contradictions between a victim's experience and the reality presented by the manipulator, then treating the victim's accurate perceptions as evidence of mental instability. The term gaslighting comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into believing she is going insane by secretly dimming the gas lights in their home while denying that the lights are changing. The psychological mechanisms underlying gaslighting are rooted in how our brains construct coherent narratives from our experiences. The technique operates through several distinct patterns that researchers have identified. Gaslighting becomes particularly powerful when it occurs in relationships where there's an inherent power imbalance. The process typically follows a predictable pattern. Initially, the gaslighter creates small contradictions that seem minor or ambiguous. The digital age has created new contexts for gaslighting through text messages, emails, and social media. The neuroscience of gaslighting reveals how this manipulation affects brain function. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how gaslighting interacts with other psychological vulnerabilities. The damage from gaslighting extends far beyond the immediate relationship. Understanding gaslighting provides crucial insights into recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of psychological abuse and control. The ethical implications of gaslighting are clear. It represents a serious form of psychological abuse that can cause lasting harm. Recovery from gaslighting typically involves rebuilding confidence in one's own perceptions, often with the help of trusted friends, family members, or mental health professionals. Gaslighting ultimately demonstrates that our sense of reality, while feeling absolute and independent, is actually socially constructed and can be influenced by others. The key to protecting against gaslighting is maintaining diverse sources of reality validation, trusting our own experiences even when others challenge them. 20. Love bombing, the weaponization of affection. Imagine meeting someone who seems perfect. They shower you with attention, gifts, and declarations of love from the very first date. They tell you you're their soulmate, that they've never felt this way before, that you're the most amazing person they've ever met. What appears to be intense love is actually a calculated strategy to bypass normal relationship boundaries and create rapid emotional attachment that can later be exploited for control and manipulation. The intensity is intoxicating, but also overwhelming. When we receive excessive affection, our brains release dopamine and oxytocin, neurochemicals associated with pleasure, bonding, and attachment. Love bombers exploit this natural response by providing overwhelming amounts of positive attention that create neurochemical highs similar to those experienced with addictive substances. They quickly escalate emotional intimacy, professing love within days or weeks, making grand gestures that seem romantic but are actually designed to create obligation and dependency. They often isolate their targets from friends and family, claiming these relationships are inferior to their special connection. The intense attention feels like finally being truly seen and appreciated, creating powerful emotional responses that can override rational evaluation of the relationship's health and sustainability. People with insecure attachment styles, low self-esteem, or histories of emotional neglect are particularly susceptible. The technique can also exploit cultural factors, using societal narratives about romance and true love to make the manipulation seem normal or desirable. Warning signs include excessive attention and gifts early in relationships, premature declarations of love, pressure to commit quickly, isolation from friends and family, and partners who seem too good to be true. Genuine love develops gradually through mutual respect, shared experiences, and growing understanding. It includes space for individual identity and outside relationships. Love bombing, in contrast, is characterized by intensity, possession, and attempts to merge identities rapidly. The intensity that feels romantic is actually a red flag for potential manipulation. Digital communication allows love bombers to maintain constant contact, sending streams of messages, photos, and declarations of affection that create the illusion of deep connection while bypassing normal relationship development. Trusting our instincts when something feels too intense too quickly, and maintaining connections with trusted friends and family who can provide outside perspectives on our relationships. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can better protect ourselves and others from this devastating form of emotional manipulation. The intense positive attention activates reward pathways in ways that can create psychological dependence. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for mental health professionals, educators, and anyone involved in helping others navigate relationships. Setting boundaries, maintaining outside relationships, and taking time to develop relationships gradually can all help protect against future manipulation. The intensity that feels like love is actually a form of psychological assault designed to create dependency and control. This creates both vulnerabilities that can be exploited and opportunities for healing through understanding healthy relationship dynamics. The technique also highlights the importance of relationship education that teaches people to recognize healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns. When the love bomber later withdraws affection, the brain experiences withdrawal symptoms similar to those seen in addiction, creating desperate attempts to regain the original high through pleasing the manipulator. Social media provides platforms for public displays of affection that can seem romantic but are actually designed to create social pressure and obligation. Victims often describe the experience as intoxicating and addictive, making it difficult to recognize the manipulation. Victims often struggle with long-term effects, including difficulty trusting their own judgment about relationships, confusion about what healthy love looks like, trauma bonding that makes it difficult to leave harmful relationships, and increased vulnerability to future manipulation. The experience can fundamentally alter how people approach intimate relationships. This isn't genuine love, it's love bombing, a manipulation technique that uses excessive affection and attention to create emotional dependency and control. Love bombing reveals a disturbing paradox about human relationships. The very behaviors that should indicate deep affection and commitment can be weaponized to create psychological dependence. The psychological mechanisms underlying love bombing are rooted in how our brains respond to intense positive attention and validation. The technique operates through several distinct phases that researchers have identified. First, the idealization phase. The love bomber presents themselves as perfect, while treating the target as extraordinarily special. Second, the overwhelm phase. They flood the target with attention, gifts, and declarations of love that exceed normal relationship progression. Third, the dependency phase. The target becomes emotionally dependent on the intense validation. Fourth, the devaluation phase. The love bomber begins to withdraw affection and introduce criticism or abuse. Love bombing becomes particularly effective because it exploits fundamental human needs for connection, validation, and belonging. The process typically follows predictable patterns. Love bombers often target people during vulnerable periods, after breakups, during life transitions, or when self-esteem is low. The digital age has created new contexts for love bombing through social media and dating apps. The neuroscience of love bombing reveals how this manipulation affects brain function. The phenomenon becomes even more complex when we consider how love bombing interacts with attachment styles and psychological vulnerabilities. The damage from love bombing extends far beyond the immediate relationship. Understanding love bombing provides crucial insights into recognizing and resisting emotional manipulation. The technique also reveals important insights about the nature of healthy versus unhealthy relationships. The ethical implications of love bombing are clear. It represents a serious form of emotional manipulation that can cause lasting psychological harm. Recovery from love bombing typically involves rebuilding trust in one's own judgment, learning to recognize healthy relationship patterns, and often seeking professional support to address trauma bonding and attachment issues. Love bombing ultimately demonstrates that our deepest human needs for connection and validation can be exploited by skilled manipulators. The key to protecting against love bombing is developing awareness of healthy relationship progression.